History is full of horrors we remember. The Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, Rwanda. These names are etched into our collective consciousness, taught in schools, memorialized in museums, and remembered as shocking warnings of humanity's capacity for cruelty. What about the genocides that we don't talk about? The ones history has buried, overshadowed by larger conflicts, or worse, deliberately erased. Entire peoples wiped out, cultures destroyed, and perpetrators who never faced justice. This is not forgotten history because it wasn't important. It's forgotten because somebody wanted it to be. At the dawn of the 20th century, decades before the word genocide was even coined, one was already unfolding in what is now Namibia. Systematic, brutal, and shockingly overlooked, it was a blueprint for mass extermination that predated the Holocaust by decades. Namibia, always then known as German Southwest Africa, part of Germany's short-lived colonial empire. Like other European powers carving up Africa, the Germans viewed the indigenous population not as people, but as obstacles that should be removed. The Herero and Nama, two of the region's largest ethnic groups, lived on vast swaths of fertile land that German settlers coveted. The plan was clear: displace them, strip them of their land, and force them into labor. But the Herero and Nama didn't submit quietly. In 1904, under the leadership of Chief Samuel Maharero, the Herero revolted, attacking German settlers and outposts. The Nama soon joined the rebellion, and for a brief moment, it seemed they might succeed in driving the colonizers out. The German response was total annihilation. General Lothar von Trotha, a man whose open racism matched his brutality, was sent to crush the uprisings. His orders were chillingly unambiguous and later likened to Hitler's policies. The Herero are no longer German subjects. Any Herero found within German territory, with or without a weapon, with or without cattle, will be executed. Women and children will be driven back to their people or shot. This was not a suppression of rebellion. It was a war of extermination. German forces targeted water sources. They poisoned wells and sealed off escape routes, driving the Herero into the unforgiving Omaheke Desert. Thousands died of thirst. Those who survived were captured and sent to concentration camps, one of the first documented uses of that term. Inside these camps, prisoners were starved, worked to death, and subjected to horrific medical experiments. German doctors, including Eugen Fischer, conducted racial studies on Herero and Nama captives, experiments that would later influence Nazi ideology. Skulls and body parts were even sent to Germany for further research, fueling the pseudoscience of racial superiority. By the time the Herero and Nama genocide ended in 1908, 80% of the Herero population had been wiped out. The Nama fared little better, with half of their people killed. For decades, Germany refused to acknowledge the atrocity, and it wasn't until 2021, over a century later, that the German government formally recognized it as genocide. Even then, reparations were refused. Instead of direct compensation to the descendants of the victims, Germany offered development aid to Namibia. The Herero and Nama genocide stands as a precursor to the horrors of the 20th century, an early example of how colonialism and racism can spiral into mass murder. It is also a stark reminder of how easily history buries its darkest moments. The early 20th century was a time of immense upheaval in the Ottoman Empire as World War I raged across Europe. The empire was crumbling from within, fighting on multiple fronts. But amid the chaos of war, something darker was taking place, a campaign of extermination that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, most people are familiar with the Armenian genocide, during which the Ottoman government systematically murdered 1.5 million Armenians. What many don't realize is that the Assyrians and the Pontic Greeks were also targeted during the same brutal campaign. Collectively, these atrocities are sometimes referred to as the Christian genocide. Yet the Assyrians, in particular, have been largely erased from historical memory. Before the genocide, the Assyrians were a stateless people living in regions that now form modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. Among the world's oldest Christian communities, they traced their heritage back to ancient Mesopotamia. But to the Ottoman rulers, they were seen as a problem. Non-Muslims in an empire veering toward radical nationalism and religious purity. Massacres began in 1914, fueled by accusations that the Assyrians were collaborating with the Ottoman Empire's enemies, particularly Russia. In reality, the Assyrians were simply caught between warring powers during World War I. Yet these unfounded accusations served as justification for their extermination. What followed was a systematic campaign of violence, executions, forced deportations, and the destruction of entire villages. Ottoman troops aided by Kurdish militias and local collaborators annihilated Assyrian communities. Thousands were forced to march into the desert where they succumbed to starvation and exhaustion. Those who resisted were killed outright. One of the most infamous massacres occurred in the town of Safo, meaning sword in Assyrian. In 1915, Ottoman forces, alongside Kurdish and Circassian militias, destroyed the town's Assyrian population. Women were taken as slaves, men and children were executed, and the elderly were left to die. For the Assyrian people, the word Safo has become synonymous with genocide, much like the word Holocaust for the Jewish people. By 1918, an estimated 250,000 to 300,000 Assyrians were dead, roughly half their entire population. Those who survived were scattered across the Middle East, becoming displaced people without a homeland. Many fled to Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, only to face further prosecution in the years that followed. Unlike the Armenian genocide, which has received partial recognition from some governments, the Assyrian genocide remains almost entirely unrecognized. Turkey denies it outright, and international awareness is minimal. To this day, the Assyrians are a marginalized and stateless people struggling to preserve their culture and identity in the shadow of one of history's most overlooked atrocities. In the mid-1960s, Indonesia became the site of one of the deadliest and most politically charged massacres of the Cold War. But like many other genocides, which were driven by ethnic or religious hatred, this one was fueled by political paranoia, foreign interference, and deep-rooted ideological fears. In the span of just a few months, between 500,000 and 1.5 million people, depending on the source, were brutally and systematically murdered with the full knowledge of Western governments. By the 1960s, Indonesia was a deeply divided nation. Its leader, President Sukarno, was a charismatic yet increasingly unstable figure who had positioned Indonesia as a non-aligned country in the Cold War. However, tensions simmered beneath the surface. The Indonesian government party, PKI, was one of the largest communist parties outside the Soviet Union and China, boasting millions of members and sympathizers. These same individuals would soon become the victims of one of the most savage political purges in modern history. The bloodshed began on September 30th, 1965, when a failed coup attempt, allegedly orchestrated by leftist military officers, triggered a cascade of violence. General Suharto, a hardline anti-communist military leader, seized the opportunity to consolidate power. Without evidence, he blamed the PKI for the coup and ordered a full-scale purge of communists, suspected leftists, and anyone with even tenuous ties to the movement. What followed was a nightmare of state-sponsored terror. Military units, police forces, and civilian death squads, often with the support of religious groups, hunted down suspected communists house by house, village by village. Victims were given no trials, no warnings, just summary executions. The killings during the Indonesian anti-communist purge were not limited to mass executions, they were spectacles of terror. Victims were tortured, mutilated, beheaded. Thousands were thrown into rivers, their bloated bodies floating downstream as grim warnings to others. Families of accused communists were also targeted, and entire villages were wiped out for alleged political affiliations. Women suspected of ties to the PKI were raped, tortured, or forced into sexual slavery. One of the most chilling aspects of this genocide is the role Western powers played in enabling it. The United States, Britain, and Australia supported Suharto's purge because it aligned with their Cold War strategy. For Washington and London, Indonesia was a critical battleground, and if it fell to communism, it could shift the balance of power in Southeast Asia. Recently declassified CIA documents reveal that the US government actively assisted Suharto's forces, providing lists of suspected communists and political targets. Meanwhile, British and Australian diplomats spread propaganda blaming the PKI for the violence while ignoring the atrocities committed by the government. By 1966, Suharto had consolidated power, establishing a military dictatorship that would last for over 30 years. The genocide was never officially recognized, and many of the perpetrators continue to live without facing any consequences. During the late 20th century, Central America became a battleground for Cold War politics, where US-backed military regimes fought brutal wars against leftist guerrilla movements. In Guatemala, however, the violence didn't just target insurgents, it escalated into a full-scale genocide against the country's indigenous Maya population. Over 200,000 people were killed, most of them unarmed civilians, in what the United Nations later recognized as acts of genocide. For decades, Guatemala was ruled by a series of military dictatorships propped up by the United States to prevent the spread of communism in Latin America. The Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted from 1960 to 1996, was marked by brutal conflict between the US-backed government and leftist guerrilla forces. By the early 1980s, however, the military's focus shifted from targeting rebels to an ethnic extermination campaign against the Maya people, whom they accused of harboring guerrilla sympathies. The most infamous period of the genocide occurred under General Efrain Urias Montt, who seized power in a 1982 military coup. A staunch anti-communist, Montt launched Operation Sphere, a scorched-earth military campaign designed to annihilate entire indigenous communities suspected of supporting the rebels. The Guatemalan military burned hundreds of villages to the ground, slaughtering men, women, and children in a calculated campaign of terror. Survivors recounted soldiers going house to house, dragging people out, executing them on the spot, and setting their bodies on fire. Women were systematically raped, often in front of their families, before being killed. Children were thrown into mass graves, sometimes still alive. Some of the most horrifying massacres took place in 1982. In the Dos Ares massacre, Guatemalan special forces entered a Maya village, raping and murdering over 200 people, including infants. In the Rio Negro massacre, nearly 400 Maya villagers were slaughtered, their bodies discarded in a nearby river. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a deliberate, government-orchestrated policy to destroy indigenous communities. By the time Montt's regime ended in 1983, over 80% of the war's victims were indigenous Maya people. The scale of the devastation was staggering. More than 600 villages were erased from the map, and entire communities were displaced, forced to live in hiding in the mountains for years. Despite overwhelming evidence, justice for these atrocities took decades. In 2013, Efrain Urias Montt became the first former head of state in Latin America to be convicted of genocide, receiving an 80-year prison sentence. But just 10 days later, Guatemala's constitutional court overturned the verdict, a move widely seen as politically motivated. A retrial was scheduled, but the court announced proceedings would not be public and ruled that Montt could not be sentenced due to his age and deteriorating health. He died in 2018, never truly being held accountable for his crimes. Unlike other genocides widely condemned by the international community, the Guatemalan Maya genocide remains largely unacknowledged outside of Latin America. While the Guatemalan government officially recognized the genocide in 1999, many perpetrators still hold power, preventing meaningful justice for the victims. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC, has endured some of the deadliest conflicts in modern history, wars that have killed millions, yet remain largely overlooked by the world. Among these atrocities was the Mbandaka massacre of 1997, a campaign of revenge, ethnic cleansing, and terror that left thousands of Hutu refugees slaughtered. To understand the massacre, we must first revisit the Rwandan genocide of 1994. When the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, ended the genocide and seized control of Rwanda, hundreds of thousands of Hutus fled into neighboring Zaire, now the DRC. This exodus included both those responsible for the killings of nearly 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus, as well as innocent civilians who were escaping the chaos. For 3 years, Hutu refugees lived in sprawling camps hidden deep within the Congolese jungle. They were caught between Rwandan-backed forces hunting them and local militias who saw them as enemies. Then in 1996, the Rwandan and Ugandan-backed forces of Laurent Desire Kabila launched an invasion to overthrow Zaire's dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko. Kabila's forces swept across the country. They systematically targeted and massacred Hutu refugees, many of them women and children, under the guise of eliminating those responsible for the Rwandan genocide. One of the deadliest massacres occurred in Mbandaka, a city along the Congo River. Thousands of Hutu refugees, most of them unarmed civilians, had fled there, desperate to escape the advancing forces. They never stood a chance. In May 1997, Kabila's troops, along with allied Rwandan forces, entered the city and began a systematic slaughter. Refugees were rounded up and forced to march to the banks of the Congo River. One by one, they were executed and their bodies thrown in the water. Survivors described entire families being shot, hacked to death, or drowned. For days, bodies floated downstream, a horrifying reminder of the brutality inflicted on those who tried to escape. At the same time, soldiers conducted door-to-door executions in refugee camps, setting them ablaze and shooting anyone who attempted to flee. Some victims were forced into mass graves while still alive. The killings continued for weeks with reports estimating that at least 2,000 to 3,000 refugees were murdered in Mbandaka alone. On July 8, 1997, the acting UN High Commissioner for Human Rights announced that as many as 200,000 Hutu refugees may have been massacred across the region. Despite overwhelming evidence, including satellite imagery, eyewitness accounts, and reports from human rights organizations, the Mbandaka massacre and the broader campaign against Hutu refugees in the DRC has never been fully prosecuted. In 1997, the UN launched an investigation, but political pressure, partially from Rwanda, ensured that no one was held accountable. The massacre, it seems, was seen as payback. The Second Congo War, which erupted shortly after these events, became known as Africa's World War, claiming over 5 million lives and making it the deadliest conflict since World War II. Yet even within that larger catastrophe, the slaughter of Hutu refugees at Mbandaka stands out as a deliberate, targeted act of genocide, one the world has all but erased from its memory. Genocide, it doesn't end when the killing stops. It ends when the world forgets it happened. The names of the victims fade. The ruins are rebuilt. Governments rewrite their history books, and suddenly the slaughtered are erased. Never remembered, never mourned. There's no justice, there's no trials, there's no reckoning. There is just silence. Some genocides were buried under the weight of larger conflicts. Others were deliberately covered up by those who orchestrated them. And some were ignored simply because the world had no interest in remembering. Yet these aren't ancient crimes. Some of the people responsible for these atrocities, they are still alive. Some even still hold power. And the world continues to look away. Thank you for watching.